Well, now that we have our warm-up act done, I will introduce the panel to you. You've already met Lily. Lily is the artist who did these beautiful paintings and spent 3 months plus, I guess, in Antarctica. It was her second trip there. Her last show with us was paintings of the surface landscapes, and these are all based on her diving experiences, which if you haven't seen, be sure to stop into the video room next door and see the video while you're here, and she'll explain a lot of this. Then with her, on the far, I guess my left, your right, is Gretchen Rollins. Hofmann, sorry. Sorry, I wasn't looking at my notes, I'm not sure. Gretchen Hofmann, who's a marine biologist and professor at UC Santa Barbara. And her main area of study is how organisms work in the face of changes to the environment, and with a specific interest, I guess, in the pteropods. These pteropods, as opposed to those pteropods.
It's all related.
It's all related. It's all connected.
And she'll explain a lot more than that, because I don't know anything about it. Next to her is Joe Levy, and this is the second time that Joe's been on one of our panels during Lily's show. He's a researcher at the University of Texas Institute for Geophysics, where he runs the Terrestrial Analogs and Changing Landscapes Lab. It's a mouthful. He's a veteran of 10 field seasons in Antarctica since 2004, and works on projects ranging from landscape change to climate change, ecology, and hydrology. And then immediately to Lily's left is Rob Robbins, who you also see in the video and who provided some of the footage in the video. He's the dive supervisor for the United States Antarctic Program. He's worked in the program for 37 years. I thought you didn't look anywhere close to that age, Rob.
He started when he was 2.
Okay, good.
Yeah, it was the first time
I had to read that a couple times before I realized that I wasn't making a mistake. And is a veteran of over 2,000 scuba dives under the Antarctic ice. And with that, I'll turn it over to Lily, who will try to be not quite as funny and more important.
Yeah, I'll be funny by accident now instead of on purpose. Thank you all for coming. All of these paintings are based on that residency that I did in Antarctica through the National Science Foundation, and there's a great program called the Antarctic Artists and Writers Program, where along with all the many researchers, there are up to 2,000 people at McMurdo Station where we were working, right? That's the capacity? 1,200. That's why they're here. It's a really big operation, and it's one of 3 stations. It's the biggest one. And there's, along with all these researchers, they send, the government selects an interloper artist or writer to sort of communicate some of the research that's happening. So that was how I got down there most recently. And I guess Clive gave a little bit of a brief introduction to all these lovely panelists, but I'd like to ask you all to explain a little bit more about what you do, give your elevator pitch on your work, and then we'll go a little deeper. So, oh yeah, you have a mic.
Hi everyone, thanks for coming. My name's Gretchen Hofmann, as you heard, and I'm a professor at UC Santa Barbara, and I have always been a marine biologist, but lately I've become a global change biologist, thinking about how the changing oceans will influence things that live in it. Whales, seals, penguins, phytoplankton fish. And sometimes when I work in California, we ask the question, will there be sushi? So we kind of say, wow, is the ocean going to change enough that it threatens our food supply? And so some of the work that I do in the Antarctic addresses that same sort of will there be sushi question, but we're asking, will there be sushi for penguins and seals? And some of the beautiful paintings you see here on the wall, this over here is Limacina helicina. It's part of the food chain in the Antarctic. And it transfers energy from marine plants to other organisms. And so we're interested in studying how climate change and ocean change will alter what is really our last marine ecosystem, that is truly our last marine wilderness, the Southern Ocean and the Antarctic. So I met Lily while we were working down there together.
Hi everyone, and thanks for coming. I'm Joe Levy. I'm a researcher at UT Austin, and I go to the coldest, driest place on Earth to study water, which is kind of a losing game. And I go to Antarctica, which is covered by kilometers of ice, to study the less than about 1% of the continent that's ice-free. And this seems like maybe I just don't know what I'm doing out there. No, so I work in the McMurdo Dry Valleys, which are the largest ice-free area in Antarctica, a little bit smaller than Delaware, and they're across the channel from McMurdo. And this is a cold polar desert where we can actually read the record of climate change in the rock record. So ice sheets come, ice sheets go over 100,000 or so year timescales, and by decoding the language of their deposits in the landscape, you can actually understand their pacing, how big the ice is, when there's ice there, and how quickly it goes away. And so all of this has really come into understanding water and water and its role in melting the cold polar desert. So the one painting that you'll see around here that's brown is the one over in the back there, and that's the color of the dry valleys. And this is part of the terrestrial ecosystem that is, again, a canary in the coal mine for climate change. So the organisms that live in this cold polar desert are dependent on a small amount of meltwater, and trying to understand how they are adapting to changing snowfall patterns and changing melt patterns in response to changing temperatures is how I spend a lot of my time. And when I'm not doing that, I'm looking at Mars, which is another whole cold polar desert to itself, trying to decode how landscapes that we see on Mars are driven by processes similar to what we see on Earth. And so I actually met Lily back in high school, but then met her again as a professional at an Antarctic science conference in Portland, Oregon. I saw this beautiful poster on that had a beautiful painting on it. I thought, that's incredible. Oh, and I know that name too. So Lily and I had a beer at the conference, and actually she was part of my field team in Antarctica, painting the landscapes and organisms that live there. Pass the mic.
Hi, I'm Rob Robbins. I work for the contractor at the National Science Foundation that provides the science support to the program. I've been doing it for, as was mentioned, 37 years now. It's hard to believe. Made over a couple thousand dives down there, and it's
Couple thousand.
yeah.
Under the sea ice.
2K, yes.
2K, 2 Gs.
So one of the things I like diving about, or I like about diving in Antarctica is Antarctica is very black and white. The place is very much a black and white place, but you get under the ice and it's just completely different. There's all kinds of colors. It's a spectacular contrast between the surface and under the ice. And I really like that, and I really like introducing people to that. And then having Lily come down and getting to, having done it for quite a few years, it's not like I've gotten tired of it, but having Lily there and seeing it through her new eyes and as an artist, it's been spectacular. And seeing her paintings and how well she's portrayed the richness of the life down there, it's been great. I appreciate having you come down.
And for those of you who came in late, yes, I am wearing a hot dog costume. And in the video, you'll see me scuba diving in this hot dog costume. And, you know, Rob you've been coming to McMurdo since 79? 79. And every year, right? And as he said, he's done more than 2,000 dives under the ice, which must be a world record. And so, you know, I didn't get to be, you know, the first person to dive under the ice, but I figured I could at least be the first person to dive under the ice in a hot dog costume, and perhaps hold the record for the most hot dog. Am I not the first? And I might have the record for the most dives, because I did 2 or 3. So, if somebody tries to, yeah. So, first and most hot dog dives. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Well, Lily actually brings up through joking something kind of amazing about Antarctica, which is it's a superlative place. I mean, we always talk about it as being the highest, driest, coldest, windiest continent on Earth, and it's at that extreme. But it's also a place from a human point of view where you can be the first to dive in a hot dog costume under the ice, or as a geologist working in the ice-free areas, the first person into a valley, the first footprint. So it's a place where we're all keenly aware of how special and remote it is, but then also how much we are the first to make impacts there.
Right.
So maybe global forces have affected it. So human presence is felt all over Antarctica, but it's a place where even our footfalls are sometimes the first. So it's a very conscious place. It's a place where you're really conscious of the environment and how we're affecting it.
Right. And up until relatively recently, I guess I'm keeping this on for now. Until relatively recently, we thought there was no terrestrial life in Antarctica. And so I'm trying to segue into, tying it back to the paintings. And Clyde said these are all based on marine subjects, but as Joe said, there is one terrestrial painting. And I'm gonna put this, actually, I'm gonna hand this to you and just talk loud. So, I'm going to highlight this painting with the black light. So all of my paintings have a layer of fluorescent paint that is translucent in white light, but glows in black light. So this is based on sort of the view from underneath the sea ice. And then this is another sort of undersea. I'm going to knock over that dog bowl. Struggles. Got unplugged somewhere along the way. Perhaps back here. Yes. Yeah. So this painting that I'm aiming towards is a painting of the organisms that were discovered relatively recently that are sturdy enough to survive on land in Antarctica. And in the foreground we have a nematode, which is a worm that feeds on bacteria, and then tardigrades on the right, that their charming common name is the water bear. So Joe, can you talk a little bit about these critters and the water tracks that shape their existence?
Sure. So when Griffith Taylor and part of Scott's party in the early 1900s came into the dry valleys, they described them as the Valley of the Dead. Nothing is here. It's a sterile, barren place. And then another member of his party joked, it'd be a good place to grow potatoes, though. Let's have something at least there. It's funny, you're back. 19th century. But since that time, groups have been studying the biology of the dry valleys because they are in fact inhabited. And then the top predator in the dry valleys are these guys, these nematode worms and tardigrade water bears. About 100 of them could fit on your pinky nail, so they're not as big and ferocious as they appear in this picture. But they really are the top predator. This is a very simple place, and this is, from a space exploration or human place in the cosmos point of view, really interesting because this is the limits of life in terms of how cold it can be before cells stop replicating, before organisms stop replicating this quick-being organism. It's a dry environment, less than 3 to 50 millimeters of precipitation a year. So that's about that much water coming out of the atmosphere, all the snow. Most of that sublimates right into gas and never actually melts. But a small amount of it does. And so when you're walking along the landscape, you're walking over this cold Mars-like desert, this crunch, crunch, sand, snow, rocks. And my interest in this really picked up a few years ago when I was walking crunch, crunch, crunch across the desert, and then crunch, crunch, squish. And for 100 years, people have been working in the dry valleys thinking that they are dry. But in fact, there's small amounts of snow and ice melt that flow down through the ground and form these things called water tracks, which are muddy, kind of like underground streams, and they're little oases in the cold desert. They're places where microbial mats, algae can thrive, forming what is an Antarctic forest. It's about that thick and might be about the size of a couple of these chairs put together, but that's a thriving Antarctic forest. And these are the grazers, the lions and tigers that live there, feeding off of the microbes. So even though it's a cold, dry largely barren place, it's a very simple place. And so small changes to precipitation, snowfall, small changes to melting, how deeply the ground ice falls every year, have a huge and outsized effect on these organisms. So there are canary in the coal mine environment for changes to terrestrial Antarctica. You can't go and ask a snowflake in a glacier somewhere, hey, is it warmer or colder? Are there more of you or less of you? That's a lot harder. But if you look at the populations of the organisms that live in this cold desert, that's a census of how Antarctica is changing. And these things have to survive every day of every year. And so they're very rapid responders.
And one of the reasons you're studying the hydrology in Antarctica is because it's sort of an analog to Mars, right?
Yeah, so I have a secret double life. I'm not a superhero, I'm also a Mars geologist, which is much less exciting. But you may have seen in the news shallow, briny flows on Mars. Everyone discovers water on Mars about once a year. But there's more and more evidence of modern water on Mars. And in particular, it's these things called recurring slope lineae. And the terrible name, but geologists are very literal minded. And these are dark streaks that are on slopes, all right, slope bark. They recur from year to year. So these dark slopes march down hillsides, and then in the Martian summer, and then vanish in the winter. And the next summer, they march down the slopes, kind of flowing at about the rate that your fingernails grow. Actually, it's really slow. But the best evidence is that these are actually shallow groundwater little melt conduits, that water is somehow melting in crater rims and on steep valley walls on Mars and flowing downhill. And where there's water, there's life. And the best analog for them, so if I mentioned the terrestrial analogs part of my lab, is trying to understand how shallow groundwater in Antarctica shapes the habitat, and then what we should be looking for with Martian rovers and spacecraft to see, are there tardigrades and nematodes? Probably not. But are there microbes that live in these water traps similar to ones that we should expect on modern Mars? And if so, how are they surviving? And how do we detect them? Are the kinds of questions that I'm trying to answer.
I have to carry this light back. So I'm going to throw the conversation back to these guys up here. Gretchen, can you talk a little bit about the other invertebrates that we're seeing and about, in terms of, we were talking about predators, talk about the relationship maybe of the two types of pteropods that I've painted.
Yeah, only if Rob will help. Okay, so Rob mentioned that the life under the water is richer than you'd expect, and this is true. So the place where we work, the water is a couple hundred meters deep, and on the bottom we have sea urchins and sponges and kind of a community you'd expect. But up in the water column, we also have a lot of small animals that are called zooplankton. This one is Limacina helicina. It's a pteropod, and this kind of life form is sort of a shelled mollusk, if you will, like a sea snail. And they were first observed even in the 1500s because they're quite visible. And they have a foot that a snail usually creeps along with that's been modified into wings. And so when they were first seen in the 1500s, they were called papillons de mer, so sea butterflies, right? And so in the oceans, they're all over the world, they're global, Arctic to the Antarctic, and they're incredibly important fish food. So strangely enough, in parts of the Arctic, there are certain salmon runs where somewhere upwards of like 50% of their diet are these teeny tiny pepper grain sized snails that are flying through the water, and the salmon just come along and just take giant bites of them. So it's like you guys, having big handfuls of peanuts, because they're also packed full of lipid. So they're incredibly nutritious. So why on earth would one study a sea butterfly in the Antarctic? Well, over time, we started to realize that globally, oceans are changing a little bit. Carbon dioxide is dissolving into the surface oceans all the time. But as we've added more CO2 to the atmosphere, the chemistry of the ocean is changing as that CO2 enters it. And it turns out that changing chemistry is literally dissolving the shells on pteropods. So Lily, this is the role of the artist, right? So I think we were always worried, and we knew they were beautiful, but the moment that we showed these to Lily and she went, and then painted these things, it cements, it arcs over to us how important these little teeny tiny guys are, right? Because she's captured this beautiful crystalline shell that they have. You can see right through it. And inside of it, they're tiny, they're little, and under a microscope you can see their heart beating. And you can see that they're full of eggs in some cases, and there's lipid all over them. And the shell has this beautiful whorl on it, and they just look bejeweled, like when you see them under a scope. Can you see them in the water, Rob?
We do see them. We see the predator quite a bit. It's much larger, but late in the season, as you know, we see these tiny deer. As Gretchen said, they're just like the size of a piece of ground pepper, and you can see them in the water, and you can actually see them moving. I mean, they're big enough to where you.
Yeah, they're kind of wacky. So they have their little parapodia, and when we got these guys, we were there in the winter, and we didn't know. This is like zoology nerd time supreme, right? Because nobody cares about these, except they're going to be very important to us. So these are juveniles that Lily's painted. Their little wings are a little longer, and what they do is they seem to have, they're able to hold a little air, and the fat makes them buoyant, and so they swim up into the water column, and then they float down, and they go, ooh, and then they swim back up, and then they go, ooh, so their behavior, their feeding strategy is very interesting. And I'm going to get to the evil guys over here pretty soon. So the way these guys get their food is they make a mucus net. They have a little gland that secretes this essential, I know it's kind of nasty, this big mucusy thing. They can take it. I'm going to say it. The kids like it. Adults are like, So they go up and they swim up and they secrete a mucus net and they sink down and they use that mucus to literally filter feed marine plants and phytoplankton out of the water. And then, yes, you guessed it, they re-eat that mucus. So kids go, they eat their boogers. I'm like, yes. Your parents will not like me telling you this, but that's what they do. But they're incredibly important because then fish eat them as they've taken energy out of the ocean. And other pteropods, this is Cleone, it's bigger, it's like that. They are vicious and nasty, and they prey only and exclusively on these little guys. And they I know they gnash into them. So lions, gazelles. Lions, gazelles. And then everything, a lot of fish eat that, yeah, Rob? Natural history time, it happens?
Right.
Yeah.
Pygonids, favorite meal right there.
So, and then there's a fish species that you described this, it's in the brash ice, the porks. You described it.
Okay, there's a species of fish that lives right in the brash ice, right underneath the ice, which is about 6 foot thick. There's platelet ice that floats up underneath the ice. And it can be anywhere from non-existent to about 30 foot thick. But the porcabiki, that's where they hang out. That's where they're going to be feeding. So that's, yeah, they're fish about 6 to 8 inches long.
So what happens is under that ice, there are these fish that eat those, and probably some of these. Some species in the Antarctic, it's stupid, but when some New Zealand biologists actually looked about 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 80% of their gut content was these. And I know, it's weird, and the first time I saw pteropods and things like this was when a biologist had a bucket of fish and it had barfed in the bucket. This is gross. I know. Eating boogers, barf. And I looked at the bottom and I said, what is that? And there were all these pepper grain things in the bottom of the bucket. And when I touched one of them, it's crunched under my thumb. And I realized, oh God, that's a shell thing. So all the energy that translates through these zooplankton members into the fish then feeds all the charismatic megafauna that we know about. The penguins, so Adelian emperor penguins eat the fish, and the seals do as well. And so what we're interested in is understanding, sort of in a global ecology context, how alterations in the oceans over time and into the future is going to change the energy transduction through the food web as that energy supplies larger predators. And we know that all over the planet, ocean chemistry is changing, even off the coast of California. And we've been doing some studies on these guys. One of my grad students in the audience, Mr. Hoshinji, will you please stand up? Oh, come on. And clapping for me. So Ubi's been doing a lot of work on these, scanning electron micrographs and looking at their physiology and how they work. He also dives. And he has sensors in the water that record the pH so that we can link the biology to what's happening. And we're doing these same studies on the coast of California, and what we're seeing is that the shells are showing really strong signs of dissolution. And we're trying to understand what that means for their future and how well they'll be able to persist as populations to continue to be fish food. So that's a big mouthful, but you know, it's a time where a lot of scientists who are basic marine biologists or scientists are coming to the table and, you know, kind of being more willing to speak up and say, yeah, so this is a problem. Right now we've got a cruise going on the west coast of the US. NOAA has a vessel called the Robert Brown that just sailed past LA about a week ago. And they're taking water measurements all along the coast to try to understand our carbonate chemistry and pH, because we know that it's changing, and we're studying the food chain here as well. It's kind of like one big effort. But I think the thing that I can say lastly about Lily's paintings is that they really do, for us as scientists, you know, it's almost like the modern era of biological illustration where she's captured them as organisms, right? But there's a compellingness about them. Like, we see them and we see beauty, but we also see like kind of like an urgency in them, like, hey, we're out here and we're telling you there's some bad stuff going on. And we'd love it if you'd listen.
Since you've introduced that topic of the sort of urgency of your research and the issues around climate change, I was just curious to talk about more of your results of your research. I know the Arctic is changing much more quickly than the Antarctic, but if you saw my last show, it was primarily paintings from my first expedition when I was with Joe in the dry valleys, and there was this one feature of exposed, you're next, of exposed ice, this ice cliff, and going back 2 years later, this last time I was there, I visited that site and it was completely different. It had completely crumbled, that ice cliff. Joe, could you just talk about some of the changes you've observed in your career or the impacts of climate change you see?
Sure. Lily has captured ecosystems and landscapes that don't exist anymore, and that's in just a matter of a couple of years, which is amazing. There are, a large part of my work is trying to understand glacial deposits that were left by ice sheets 20,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago. And these are sand and rock and ice, and that's what the whole record is. It's like tree rings spread out across the whole environment, only it's a moraine here, a pile of rocks here left by a glacier. And all of that is held together by ice. And in the last 15 or so years, ice has been thawing more along the Antarctic coast than really any other time since the last ice age. So all these deposits, which are held together by ice, that's the glue that binds them, have started to melt. And where there's melting, there's more melting. And the phenomenon is you've all experienced it. If you ever pulled a pizza out of the oven with a pot holder is dry, and so it's a good insulator. But as soon as you spill your cup of wine on that pot holder or get it in the sink, it's wet, all of a sudden it's not a very good pot holder at all. It conducts heat. This happens to me a lot with the spilling of the wine and the pizza. And that's what that painting of the water track, that ecosystem works because it's wet. And there's deep thaw every year that provides a lot of water to the organisms that live there. But as there's more melting, and as these deposits thaw, there's more water moving through these cold desert soils, which they've been dry for the last 20,000 years, the last 100,000 years in cases, or in some cases, even millions of years. But as soon as they get wet, they go from being good insulators to being good conductors. And so there's actually a positive feedback that we've been seeing where there's some thaw of ground ice or buried glaciers from the last ice age, or even ancient ice from the Miocene when there were all kinds of different organisms living in Antarctica, that once that starts to melt, it snowballs somewhat out of control, and those deposits won't be back until the next ice age. So we're actually losing, we're kind of burning the library of climate change in Antarctica before our eyes, where the very deposits that we want to study to understand the pace of melting are melting away in front of us, which is somewhat alarming. And so it's a real privilege to have preserved images, and really evocative preserved images of these landscapes before they turn into mud, or before the sea ice melts and that habitat is just gone. So it's Lily's captured a snapshot in time, hopefully for posterity, or at least for for our record.
Yeah, and the dry valleys organisms that I've painted also prefer, they've evolved to do well in a very dry, very cold, obviously, climate. So as this area gets more wet, that particular species of nematode is sort of getting crowded out in some spots by another species, which is...
Well, so this is the story of biology in Antarctica, and I should let the biologists talk about this, is organisms that have adapted to the cold or the dry or the salt, salinity in the dry valleys can't move very fast. The whole world, a couple of meters is the whole world to a nematode if you're less than a millimeter long. And so there are organisms that like water. They like nice fresh water, so they like the glacial streams. There are organisms that like the salt and the salty dry soils. Those are the Scottnema Antarctica. They have traditionally lived in water tracts, in these shallow groundwater features, because those are moving salts down the landscape. So they're little concentrators of salt, little rivulets of brine. But now, as there's more thaw, more soil salts are washing in, and so it's actually, in some places, increasing the salinity beyond the point where beyond the point where the freshwater species can survive in the water tracts. And then for the species like the salt, they don't like the water, so they're being edged out. So these places that have been Antarctic oases are kind of being depopulated. They become nematode graveyards. And the question, the big biological question will be, who moves into that new habitat? How will the changes that have been wrought in the environment translate into different species for future painting projects?
Right. And then, Rob, as you have some sort of anecdotal observations about changes in the visibility of the water on there, do you want to talk? Luckily, we're not at a scientific conference, so we can just tell you what we personally observed, and we don't have to present actual results. No data made up. Oh, and by the way, there are still like a few seats up front, so there's like four seats, no, 5 seats. So if you can come on up to the front, yeah. We want you to be comfortable.
Not too comfortable. Talk about boogers again.
One of the very interesting things about diving in Antarctica, or at least in McMurdo Sound, is the visibility. It's just incredible, up to 1,000 feet, really, or it had been.
Which is, if you dive at all, probably the best visibility elsewhere in the world is like 100 feet.
Yeah, I mean that's commonly considered very good visibility, 100 feet. But
It's 10 times.
yes, 10 times that. So very, very special. Actually, just in the time I've been there, which isn't that long, you can see that the visibility is not what it used to be. In fact, actually, I just got a paper from Paul Dayton yesterday. There is data. I don't have it. I haven't read it. It's on my computer. But yeah, so there's documentation that the visibility is decreasing, and that's primarily from things like this that are living in the water column. So there's a lot more life in the water column. There's also a lot more brash ice that's forming. When I first started diving down there was very little brash ice that formed on the underneath surface of the sea ice. But now, the last few years, more and more of that is happening. And Chris Fritzen, the bio project manager at NSF, feels that potentially that's caused from the decreased salinity from the water coming into underneath the Ross ice shelf. And so it's just slightly more likely to freeze. And so we're getting a lot more brash ice, which is interesting, but it's dangerous. We don't like it.
One thing that
Go
might
ahead.
be interesting to say, though, is it's not all gloom and doom in Antarctica.
No,
And that's important too. There's also some really thrilling discovery happening that's relevant to this. And one reason that I think it's nice to have the dry valleys painting in this suite of marine paintings is we've recently found that the dry valleys, which are coastal, they used to be fjords, they used to be flooded when sea level was higher, are connected to the sea. And there are actually places where brine or salty water is flowing out through the permafrost, through the frozen ground, and draining out potentially into the Southern Ocean. So all of these processes that go on land, that the nematodes are experiencing, the tardigrades are experiencing, the glacier melt, the concentration of soil salts, the biogeochemistry where organisms are breaking down rocks and releasing nutrients, all of that brine is slowly oozing its way out to sea. And these systems that you think land and ocean, not connected, actually may be connected by water. And so what goes on in these small ice-free portions of Antarctica may be affecting the global Southern Ocean. And so it's exciting. We just didn't know that 5 years ago. Everyone thought everything's frozen, it's all locked up, it's not going anywhere. But there are these unexpected connections between scientific disciplines and between between art and science too. So we're learning new things every day, which is great. There's a question.
I have like so many questions, so I have like
Let's do that now.
Yeah, wait.
I don't want to interrupt you.
No, you should, but actually,
I won't ask that.
yeah, no, ask it.
It's okay.
Go ahead.
I can just go with one at a time and then later on I'll bother you again.
Yeah. We'll open it up to questions, so start thinking of some, so
Okay.
there's not too much awkward silence.
The question I had is about the tardigrades and the nematodes and the life there. Are they, in terms of like how they are there, are they leftovers from a larger biodiverse system that basically existed there in a warmer climate and then basically everything else died and they're left there? And also, are some of the tardigrades, I know they can go into a kind of hibernation mode, and are some of them like really old that just like came back to life because the water got around them?
So both of those are really good questions. The first answer to the question is, are these larger organisms a remnant from a past, more rich ecosystem? We don't know is the short answer. It's an area of really active research. 34 million years ago, before the ice sheets started growing, there were trees growing in Antarctica. There were beetles and ponds. It was actually kind of like the coast on the northwest. It was real nice. And one of the big questions driving ecology in Antarctica now, particularly in the terrestrial environment, is how do organisms survive these ice ages? When the ice sheets grow and habitat is cut off, where are the refugia? Where do the organisms hang out and live? And it may be that they live in fumaroles, in volcanically heated areas. It may be that things that can survive in the cold and dry don't mind. They just dehydrate and wait for better conditions. And so I've never been able to ask a tardigrade how old it was. It's impolite to ask, I think. But it's so you've stumped me there. But they are exceptionally hardy, and if we've seen in streams that have been deactivated for decades, that as soon as water is reintroduced to them from the glacier melts and water flows down as a stream, and eventually those channels can get diverted. But as soon as you reintroduce water, algal mats that were living in that stream that you just didn't know were there because they looked like they were covered with sand, rebloom and reblossom. So the Antarctic ecosystem is one that's waiting for better conditions. It's an exceptionally patient ecosystem.
Yeah, and did you?
Another Antarctican just entered, so I was a little distracted. Brendan, who does mapping basically, but fancy mapping, is here. Did you mention that nematodes also cryogenically freeze themselves?
Okay, so the nematodes and the tardigrades can do something called anhydrobiosis, where they literally freeze dry themselves and then wait for better conditions to come along, which is a good strategy because you might not get snowfall one year. If it snows, it might not melt, it might just sublimate away. And so this is, one of these sort of practical applications of Antarctic science is trying to figure out how organisms mummify themselves and then come back, from what is basically a dead state. And so it's very much beyond my experience as a hole digger, but it's something that you get a lot of respect for these organisms that have some incredible adaptations.
Yeah. Penguins don't come back though. They're screwed. They're screwed. Yeah. Shall we? What time is it? Should we open it up to questions?
I think it's time for questions.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anybody?
I have one. Okay, I just wanted to ask all of the well, I mean, also you, Lily, but anybody else, I mean, the people who have been basically representatives of climate change and things that are actually happening in your experience and before your eyes, when you encounter people who are kind of incredulous about climate change, I'm always curious, like, what happens when a person who actually has data and who has experienced this kind of thing and who actually can speak from personal experience, and you know, what happens when you encounter somebody who is kind of like wanting to just say it's not happening? And maybe you guys could all answer a little anecdote or something.
Tales from the trenches.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's a really good question. So the times, they are changing, right? So I'm your tax dollars at work. And so is everyone who works in the Antarctic. We're funded by federal dollars to be there. And so part of what I do is I talk to policymakers and from the federal to state level, local government, city planners, worry about sea level rise. I'm working hard for California right now, thinking about coastal hypoxia. And 10 years ago, 7 to 10 years ago when I started doing this, because I'm a second generation climate scientist and I thought if I don't step up, nobody will. It was ugly, man. I'm gonna tell you right now. So I don't want to be political right now. But at one point, it's okay. No, I don't want to do that because this is not the time or the place. But one time I was asked to go speak to the Republican Science Committee when I was walking the Hill for some stuff. That was brutal. They came after me personally. They said, you're full of it. And I said, no, actually, this is a thing. You know, we had a conversation. So it was very hurtful, but that was a long time ago. So now I think the unfortunate truth now is that has really gone down because we've had so many events now on the planet that really suggest that the global climate is changing. And we cannot debate these semantics. Well, global warming, well, it's always hot, you know, or geez, you know, because, you know, India just had its record high the other day, and April was the warmest month we've had on the planet according to the satellite data. So it's really going down. And so my problem with talking to climate deniers is pretty much over. And my job now is to talk about solutions. So the thing that I want to do right now is elevate the mood in this room. Last thing I want to say is because we're working, because we're doing this kind of work, we're learning a lot, okay? So some of the research that people are doing are learning that populations of organisms out there already, fish, have a lot of genetic diversity already, right? So they're kind of adapt to their environment, and it's going to change a little bit, and it could be, and it is true, that there are genotypes that can stand it. So it's likely that we're not going to lose all fish. It's like we're not going to have a complete obliteration of marine ecosystems, and the terrestrial environment's going to be okay too. But we're going to have change, and we're going to have shifts. And so now we want to sit back and go, okay, how do we prepare for those shifts, and how can we predict where they're going to happen the most in a way that harms humans the most, right? So people are sitting down and going, all right, what's more vulnerable? You know, fish or pteropods? Where do we put our science? Where do we put our money? And we're trying to figure this out. But I think it's changing big time. And I think the news is sometimes not great because look, the barrier reef is having some bleaching problems right now. But we know in those coral that there are genotypes that can take it, and it'll come back. We'll have some change, but it'll be all right. So it's going to be all right. But the thing is, we have to change the way we're doing things, right? We need new technology. We need to liberate ourselves from fossil fuels. We need to stop releasing so much CO2 in the environment because we still have a chance. We really do.
But it does seem like the majority of people in Congress are denying that they're, or even half of the people in Congress.
I know.
Openly deny it, but then maybe behind the ones with you, they're listening to you.
They are listening, and
despite denying it publicly.
yeah. So the strange thing, I gotta tell you, this is weird. So no one should record this at all. But there are, I think it just got released. One of the U.S. academies just released a climate map and climate preparedness because they know some of this stuff is going to drive global conflict. So the strange thing is some of our policymakers at the federal level refuse to think about this, but quietly, back in the trenches where a lot of federally funded people work, things are being done. Grassroots communities are being formed. We're thinking about how climate's going to affect aquaculture. People up in Sacramento right now are working on how do we think about marine protected areas that we preserve for fishing for climate change. So I know it's really disheartening to go, what up, Senator? How can you talk like this? That's their job, to be a talking head. And what happens, I always think, is that it's the funnel of the media, like that's what we hear. But really down here in my mind, I'm you don't see it, but like we're linking arms across all these different groups that are working on climate efforts. And I think it's good. I think it's good.
Do you have anything you want to add?
The only thing I would add is the conflict is sometimes between identity versus observations. And as a geologist, I'm working as making observations, and I try not to hold on to any particular idea or hypothesis too much because it might be wrong. But if your constituents are depending on you supporting one particular point of view, then as an elected representative, they sometimes have this ugly habit of holding on to antiquated, outdated ideas that aren't supported by evidence. And so trying to just get people to be aware of what I do in the field every day, what I do in the lab every day, how I make the observations I make, and why I've drawn the conclusions I have. And particularly, I like to tell people how many times I've been wrong, how many things I've thrown out, so they understand that I'm not holding on to one idea because I thought it was a great one. I'm not trying to say that ground ice in Antarctica is melting faster than any time since the last ice age, because I like it. I'm saying it because it was the only idea that stood up the test of observation. And so the more we get people to understand what observations are being made, what actions are being taken in response to it, it becomes less about ideology and more about getting things done and adapting and surviving.
I have a question for Lily about how you create your paintings down in Antarctica. I assume you aren't wielding a paintbrush down below the sea ice.
They're watercolors. They're
Yeah, actually, I think when I wrote my proposal, I had done some diving where I got to sketch on a slate. And so when I wrote my proposal, I had suggested doing that. But we have to wear these lobster claws, basically, on our hands. They're like giant mittens. And so it is hard to wield a drawing implement that way. So what I did do was, for the dives, I got to collect organisms that I wanted to paint. So, like those nudibranchs over there that Clyde is standing next to, got to collect them and keep them alive in a touch tank and then look at them while I was painting. So I started that painting, I had a little studio on station. So I'd take the critters back to station, and I started that painting when I was down there. And then I also took video, and Rob takes video and photos on every dive. So actually that painting, I also used one of Rob's photographs as a reference too. A lot of these paintings use his videos and photographs as reference. So we both shot footage on pretty much all of our dives. And then, yeah, like the pteropods, I would go out with Umi and we'd collect them, drill little holes in the sea ice and just collect them from the surface, and then go back to the station and look at them under a microscope and make sketches. And then Umi and his colleague Kevin sent me images as well that I use as a reference. So it's like a combination of memory, sketches in the field, or sketches from life, and then video and photo. And then when I'm out with Joe, I do paint in plein air a little bit. I definitely make drawings in plein air and sometimes make paintings, and then use those as sort of studies to make the larger paintings from. So there are a lot of different tactics. Yeah.
That's one of my most memorable moments with Lily, because we didn't really know each other very well, because another artist had connected us, Henry Kaiser, who was a musician, had been down there. And we just met, and I said, hey, come in the field with us. And we went out on skidoos because we had to go to where Umi was going to collect through the sea ice. And we said, oh, Lily, we don't know you very well, but take this skidoo and run around and do some stuff and don't hurt yourself. And so we thought, well, great. So you were gone for like 30 or 40 minutes, and you came back, and she had her sketchbook. And when she came back, she opened it up and went, yeah, I did this and I did that. And we just stood there and went, oh my God, they were beautiful. And I felt like it was like, being with Ponting or something, like the new Ponting, because Ponting was a really famous photographer with Scott's expedition who took all those famous photographs. And Lily was just running around actually sketching some of the very same things that he photographed. And it was like, I'll never forget, I was like, oh my God, you just like sketched the most famous cape in the world in Antarctic discovery. Who are you? Yeah, that was so cool.
In addition to being just a prolific artist in the field, Lily is also a great thermometer, because on days that you would go out and her paints would freeze, we knew it was going to be a really cold slog in the field that day. But it's incredible being out on these cold, sort of dreary hikes under a gray sky in the cold polar desert, because we would get to a field site, whether it's a water track or a buried ice exposure, and all the scientists put down their backpacks after a couple of miles of hiking and pull out their field notebooks and the GPS and the camera, and everyone is trying to make sense of the stratigraphy of an outcrop, where there's ice, where there's a rock layer from one moraine or another. And then Lily has pulled out her sketchbook too, and it was just amazing kind of stepping back and seeing my students trying to make sense of an outcrop and Lily trying to make sense of an outcrop, and seeing that the things that are aesthetically appealing about this landscape are also the variations that we're looking for signs of past climate conditions. And so the record is not just useful, but it's also beautiful.
Thanks. And, sure. I wanted to pick on Rob, though, too, to talk about what your experience, how did diving with an artist differ from like the normal sort of research dives? Normal.
No, actually, I think I mentioned before, I really like diving with Lily a lot. One, I like to bring people that haven't been down under the ice before to see their reaction, because it is spectacular. And two, knowing that Lily has this artist's eye, and she would come back and do this work. It was special to be able to be part of that. So yeah, no, I just, I like diving. It's great. But yeah, so I think that more than most people that I dive with, Lily appreciated appreciated being in the environment. She wasn't just trying to get her little organism or whatever. She was trying to get a sense of what the environment was like, and I think she did a great job.
Yeah, when I wrote my proposal, I thought I'd get to do maybe like 2 dives under the ice, and I ended up getting to tag along with Rob almost every day for the first month I was down there. So I got to do 25 dives, which was really special. Yeah, and he's a great mentor, so my diving improved a lot. Yeah. I was a novice. I mean, by the time I got there, I'd done 75 or 100 dives or something, but I learned to dive so that I could dive in Antarctica. So all of my diving was in preparation for that experience.
Yeah, we have a certain minimum requirements for people to dive down there, and Lily had basically just met those requirements. But she was fine. I mean, she was comfortable in the water, and she was fine. And more than anyone I have dove with in Antarctica, Lily improved every dive. We would get back to the dive locker, and she'd talk to the other divers that were with her and ask, hey, I think I may have done this wrong, or I could have improved here. And so seeing your progression as a diver was exciting to us too.
Okay, Andrea.
Hi. Hello. I had a couple of color questions for you. My first question was, so when you got there and you started sketching in the field, was there a certain color that you were like, damn it, if only I had this one color, everything would come together better? Did you have that experience?
Oh yes, yeah. It was actually terrible. No, it was frustrating. I had to ship down all my paints like 3 months ahead of time. And so I was anticipating what I would need. And I knew that I got the idea to go to Antarctica because one of the oceanographers I was working with showed me images of diving there. And I was like, that's the most beautiful place on the planet. I have to paint it, but I have to see it for myself because photographs don't do it justice. So it was actually really difficult to anticipate the colors I would need, and I had some idea, but There's microalgae that grows in the ice that makes it these crazy colors, like that painting behind you. The palette is pretty true. These neon greens and golds and really bright turquoises. And yeah, I thought I would get a lot of painting done down there, but I ended up spending more time diving than I expected, and I actually didn't have a lot of the colors that I wished I had. And when I came back, I kind of had to rethink my entire palette. Like, I tried, especially the blue was really hard to capture, so I tried probably 12 different blues and like texted a bunch of painter friends for advice, and yeah, it was a complicated process getting the color, because it's just such a dazzling environment. Henry Kaiser, who Gretchen mentioned, describes diving in Antarctica as like mainlining LSD, which is actually like the best description I can think of. Not that I have mainlined LSD, but it's like beyond just tripping. It's this steady stream of just earth-shattering, mind-blowing color and crazy formations, and just total, everywhere in Antarctica is totally unlike anywhere else on the planet. It's completely otherworldly, and your sense of scale is totally, you can't get a grasp on scale. You can see forever, both underwater and above water. Obviously, there's no foliage to sort of ground you, so it is almost like being inside an abstract painting, which is sort of why I started painting more abstractly after I got back too. So. Wait, before Lisa asks her question, we turned off the video. It's back on? Okay, we didn't want to mention we didn't want to record what you told us not to record,
Oh,
so.
yeah,
Yeah.
doesn't matter.
Well, our videographer took you seriously. Thank you, Sarah. Okay, sorry, Lisa.
I have a question for the geologist. You mentioned sort of in passing that Antarctica looked quite different, and that it was maybe similar to the Northwest. And so I'm wondering, I'm sure you arrive at that through collection data over long periods of time and different angles on that idea. But I'm wondering, were you able to find like really clear evidence that more than micro organisms lived there? Were there mammals or dinosaurs or trees or things like that? I'm just really curious about what it looked like, because wasn't it supposed to be like a supercontinent that broke apart or something like that?
Yeah, so Antarctica is the continent of Antarctica is the core of a broken apart supercontinent. So you can find pieces of Antarctic geology in South Africa, in India. It's sort of the last big chunk of this ancient supercontinent. And so the fossil record is incredibly rich. I mean, again, I always like to say Antarctica defies our imagination because it's been so different in the past. So there are in the Transantarctic Mountains, which are the backbone of Antarctica, running from the peninsula all the way down really to the McMurdo area, there are dinosaur fossils that expeditions have been mounted the last couple of years to fly out, land on the ice, go up these ancient sandstones and extract the dinosaur fossils. Even in the dry valleys near McMurdo, where I work, there are, again, 30 to 40 million year old beetle fossils and plant fossils. There are leaf imprints from the Northophagus tree. So there is this whole record of a much warmer, more clement environment in Antarctica. And what's interesting is Antarctica as a continent has been in more or less the same place by the South Pole for much of this time period. So it's a record of extreme climate change. And we are on this trajectory back towards a much warmer environment, which is totally different. So we're moving into we're making Earth an alien world in some ways, where if you can imagine trees growing in Antarctica, that's the future, potentially.
Okay, can I just ask one more thing about the dry valley? So are the dry valleys considered quite special within Antarctica? They're a very small a piece of Antarctica?
Yeah, so it's a tiny area. The canonical measurement is about 20,000 square kilometers. If you actually just take the area that's truly ice-free, where there's soil and rock, it's only about 4,500 square kilometers, so it's really small. But it's the largest ice-free area. Ice, it wants to spread out over the whole continent. And what makes the dry valleys interesting climatically is that there's the transantarctic mountains holding back the ice. So there's a barrier to ice flowing, but there's kilometers of ice. So the ice pours through the passes between the valleys and enters down into the valleys. But the air coming off the polar plateau is cold and dry. And so as it descends off the ice cap, it accelerates and it starts going faster and faster and faster. It falls down several thousand feet off the top of the plateau and warms, and when it warms it becomes even drier, and so that actually sublimates the ice away and carries this ice off, leaving the valleys dry. So they're a special climatic environment, and as a result they're this place where we can understand Earth processes in under polar conditions, which we wouldn't be able to otherwise. Otherwise in Antarctica we'd just be able to look at the rocks coming out from under the ice cap and under the ice sheets. So it's a very unique natural lab.
Anyone? One last question.
So, okay, my last question is for Lily. Sorry, I shouldn't say mine. I mean, I've asked so many, I kind of like letting you know I'm not going to do it anymore. So having, I went to grad school with you, so I know that, you are a painter, and so you're part of this tradition connected to art history, and I know that there may be kind of art historical precedents of being connected to science, but I do feel like there's maybe something different that you are doing in terms of relating to science. Like you're not just an Audubon, you're not just somebody who's describing, new creatures in a space. But I also feel like, I wonder whether your process has really been affected just listening to the scientists that you're with. I mean, it's such a different way of looking at the world in terms of processes, and also even just the processes in the landscape. You're seeing these things happen as opposed to just painting a static landscape. Like, could you describe the relationship to the landscape and how that's changed your painting, and also the scientific methodologies that are all around you, and how that's changing your art practice?
Yeah. Well, that's such a good question that it's so good that I don't have like a tidy answer for it, because it is very like an open question that I think about all the time. But when I was in grad school, I first started painting deep sea organisms, and it came from a very just an aesthetic interest of like, these creatures look really cool and I want to capture them in paint. And then I had this personal sort of reason for it too. But then in order to see the specimens that I wanted to paint, I had to contact the scientists that were studying them, because I like to work from observation. So that's how that relationship started. And I was actually very nervous about sort of being categorized as an illustrator instead of an artist, because there is this sort of divide. And so at first I was a little bit resistant to learning too much about what I was painting. But then as I learned about the biological backstories, or the scientific facts around the subjects I was painting, the more I realized that that was much more interesting and engaging and poetic than any fiction I could superimpose on them as an artist. Like I had tried to position them as sort of psychological symbols of like human psychological states. And then I realized, no, these organisms and these landscapes are fascinating in and of themselves. And I actually learned to draw from copying my dad's bird books. So my own style is inherently tied to illustration and that history. And I feel like most of our world has been very much explored in depth, but these areas like Antarctica and the deep sea, they're still relatively new to us. And they're going away before we have a chance, or changing really quickly before we have a chance to really understand them. So I feel even more aligned with people like Audubon or even Dürer, who were documenting new discoveries as they were happening. But now we have digital photography, and that's a great way to document that stuff and share it very efficiently. Like, we don't need illustration in the same way. So I have a lot more liberty as a painter. So I get to pull from all these different traditions, like the tradition of natural illustration and then the tradition of like abstract expressionism, and use that combination to kind of elicit like an emotive response from my audience, like what Gretchen touched on earlier, like trying to get some investment from my audience in the research. And there's only so much information that I can convey, but it's a great jumping off point for discussions like this. So it sort of starts the conversation. Does that?
Lily, can you describe your position or talk more about using the black light and then how that...
Yeah. Manya asked if I could talk about using the black light. It's rooted in a long-standing love of the luminous qualities of like still life, Flemish still life painting. So it's a way to achieve luminosity. But it kind of started with painting organisms that were bioluminescent or glow in the black light in real life. Like, I think my very first black light painting was a scorpion. And if you don't know scorpions, you can find by shining a black light on them and they glow. So that's how it started. And then it just became like a really efficient way for conveying like the glow of the sea ice, or in painting the ice cliff that Joe was studying, that luminosity of the ice itself, and using that to contrast with the earth around it, or the till around it. So that's kind of how that developed. And then I also get a kick out of the like kitsch psychedelia associations, I guess, of blacklight art. Like,
when you're in your studio, you're using black light as a paint.
well, I've set up this like impossible scenario for myself as a painter where I want my paintings to work well in any light, so white light, black light, or a combination of the two. So in the black light, the fluorescent paint I use actually is sort of translucent and not very visible in white light. So I basically have to do each painting twice. I do the whole thing with regular paint, and then I turn on a black light and redo it with fluorescent paint. And I'm constantly like turning on the white lights, turning off the black lights, turning off the white light, on the black light. So it's, yeah, it's a little complicated, but it's worth it to me. I enjoy it.
I have a question for the marine biologist. So the tardigrades have sort of captured the popular imagination. I mean, if I know about them, then I'm sure most people know about them. But the principles that are interesting to you, like this cryogenic properties that they have, where they can go to sleep for years or whatever and be awoken. So are there a lot of creatures like that that you know of that can manage that? And why is it so interesting to a scientist to understand that property? What can be useful going forward to understand those principles?
Yeah, so I guess answering them backwards, I mean, I think scientists who work on biology per se at that level are really interested in a couple different things. Mechanism, reductionist stuff. So how is that organism turning down its metabolism or preserving itself so that it can rouse again? So there have been some strange things, like we've learned that some of these organisms use sugars like trehalose. They'll build up some sugars. Other invertebrates do this too, and so the sugar in their cells acts like a preservative. And we've used that in some of our technologies to, say, preserve things in cell culture. So we've learned from Mother Nature and used those tools. So a lot of times it's a reductionistic thing. The other one is ecological. So people want to understand, ecologists, biologists want to understand, what are the factors that determine where things live on the planet and how are they distributed? So how do they do that? And so a lot of these extreme life forms that do this biosis or can do severe anhydrobiosis, losing all their body water and still coming back. There are some invertebrates that do that, like Artemia, and some insects also do it. It's an extreme response to environmental variation. When water goes away, when it gets too cold, when it gets too hot, it's a form of dormancy. It's an extreme form of like hibernation, something we kind of understand, metabolic sleep. Sleep is a form of it that we understand in our bodies, right? So, people are interested in like, wow, when on the planet do things start employing these super extremo solutions? And it's usually in a place where there's extreme environmental variability, like the dry valleys. And then one step more is that we started thinking extraterrestrially, like, wow, if this goes on Earth, if there are other places, other planets that have water that could support life, could those organisms also use these mechanisms? So there's been, a lot of interest in extraterrestrial planetary approaches, like places like JPL, routinely, without irony, have people who are studying life on other planets, like how could it possibly work? So I don't know if that answers your question, but.
And do you know of a lot of organisms that can do this? I mean, at that level, the microorganisms in Antarctica, or they're just,
Not really. No, I mean, I think the answer is the organisms that have been identified, the nematodes and these types of organisms in the soil ecosystems, are probably the only ones that we really know about. But there's always this element of we haven't found everything. So it's really routine for a zoologist to say to you something like, well, there are about 70,000 mollusks on the planet, but we bet there are 250,000 of them, and we just haven't found them all because we haven't explored the deep oceans and we haven't been to all these places and identified them yet. So they're unique right now. Yeah.
Are there any larger scale organisms that are capable of that, or is it just?
Are there larger scale organisms, bigger ones?
Yeah, bigger than the nematodes that are capable of that sort of. Does it become hibernation then if it's things like frogs and things like that? Or
So it kind of scales with complexity of the organism, let's say. So if we think about going across the span of cold-blooded things to warm-blooded things, and small bodies to large bodies, there are lots of costs of maintaining that body form. So if you're going to become quiescent like a nematode can, and you're your size, you've got a lot of work to do. You've got a lot of tissue to shore up, You're a fit, muscular guy right now, right? And if you go to sleep for 6 months to a year, that's a lot of tissue that you're going to have to preserve in sugar, so energetically, it's probably not going to happen. However, as a mammal, you're warm-blooded, and some parts of our mammalian lineage have evolved these really pretty stupendous mechanisms that we as humans are really interested in, actually, to be able to suspend activity, to go to sleep, to hibernate. And we have mammals of lots of different sizes that do this in different degrees. So some squirrels, small mammals, man, they are good at it. They can knock themselves out. They use all these respiratory acidosis mechanisms. They can stay asleep for a really long time. Bears can also do it, but they tend to be winter sleeping, really quiescent. And the reason they can do this is they figured out a metabolic trick that everybody wants to understand in medicine, because they regulate their fat metabolism in a really amazing way. They store it, they fatten up before they go into hibernation, and they have these hormones that allow them to regulate their fat metabolism to just kind of sip away at their fat stores. And there's some crazy things, like there are marmots that before they go into hibernation, let's say they weigh 10 pounds, they go into hibernation, they weigh like 22 pounds. They over double their weight. They can barely move. They go hibernate. They sip away at that fat. They come out the same size, and they do it all over again. And so, literally, the community that studies type 2 diabetes and fat metabolism really want to understand how these animals work. And so the crazy thing is there are people at medical schools that are working in the Rocky Mountains to study hibernating ground squirrels and marmots. So the ability to suppress metabolism exists across the organismal, all biology, but it varies in intensity with size and what history you have. Are you cold-blooded? Are you warm-blooded? And are you big-bodied? What do you have to maintain? Yeah.
Hi, keeping up with the topic, it's what's the oldest thing that you've discovered that like it was dormant for a long time that you brought back?
Well, there's the thing. I mean, we'll start with that.
We don't usually talk about it. Turn the camera on.
No, one really, there's the organisms that suppress metabolism and stop their biological processes. But then what's sort of equally interesting and opposite to that are the organisms that survive in extreme cold, extreme dryness. Lily and Rob are wearing dry suits and not spending too much time underwater because otherwise they would freeze to death. And so the organisms that can swim around in these cold conditions are kind of equally as fascinating. So to answer your question, the sort of oldest organism that I've interacted with are microbes that live in debris-covered glaciers. So in the highest, driest, coldest part of the highest, driest, coldest continent, in a place called Beacon Valley, there's glaciers that are 8 million years old. So this is thought to be the oldest ice on Earth, and the reason they're so old is because they're in a deep freeze. They don't melt, they don't sublimate. There's a very small amount of snow coming in, and that snow turns to ice and slowly creeps downhill. And what's fascinating is if you pull up ice cores from this glacier, you can pull up a 1-million-year-old ice core, and then a 2-million-year-old ice core, and march your way down to 8 million years. And there are actually microorganisms living in the ice, living in the interstices between the ice crystals. And there's evidence of gene swapping between these critters. So the microorganisms that have been incorporated into the ice are living just fine in the little melt pools between the ice grains and are doing normal microbe things, eating each other and swapping genes. So there's actually sort of 8 million-year-old genetic activity going on in there. So it's, it sort of sounds like science fiction. It sounds like The Thing, but there's this whole, ecosystem we just didn't know about until someone thought, let's core up this old ice.
I think one more question, if there is one, and then I will do yours. But we'll hang out afterward, yeah.
It's a little bit of a different question. Lily, I was thinking, you're going to Antarctica to do this. If you would do the coral reef, you would sort of just go on your own on a boat, probably.
Right.
But you're I imagine like some sort of Antarctic camp you're all at, like literally. And with the scientists, like, is there a lot more communication with other scientists sort of being there, or discovery sort of happening at a hyper rate, or you're like learning a lot more communication? Does that sort of society you've created up there, does it sort of change how you do, how work is progressing?
Oh, I was going to have Rob answer that. Well, I'll start, and then everyone else will keep going. That's right. That's right. Well, so in this order, so the United States funds a lot of different research activities, and the U.S. Antarctic Program is one of them. We have 3 stations around Antarctica, and we just all happen to be working at one called McMurdo Station. And you're right. You just can't go to Belize and say, hey, I'm going to study corals. We fly with the U.S. Air Force and some Air National Guard to get there. So the only way to get into the program is to apply, write a grant, or work for the program to get there. And it does kind of put us all together there as a small community. We all have really different backgrounds. The science is really diverse. So I think we do talk to more people from different disciplines than we would otherwise.
It's true. I think that it's a super diverse place, as far as the folks that are there. There's everyone. There's hairdressers. But there's a bunch of scientists.
Many hairdressers.
Per capita. This doesn't just happen.
But it does seem like for y'all, you get to interact with people of other disciplines, and for us, it's fascinating.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm sure for you guys, it helps with what you do.
Yeah, I mean, it's you guys, the scientists, but we're all really one giant community because you know, the scientists are down there to do one thing, but we can't do it without everyone around us. So, you know, Rob very humbly says, you know, I help scientists, blah, blah, blah. But Rob routinely says, hey, you know, I see larval fish over here. He's set up research programs with his observations. And so, you know, we're all kind of tied to each other. And I think one of the things that I think that's most important about it when I go down there actually is that it's an amazing training ground. You know, you evolved hugely as a diver, but when I bring 20-year-olds down there, they evolve hugely as people. So a lot of times I bring my grad students, and for me, this is like the hidden, internal, wonderful core of these kinds of programs, is that, you know, I'll routinely take someone down there who thinks that their biggest problem is their cell phone is not charging very well or long enough. And then all of a sudden we find out, oh no, yeah, there's a bad storm and your radio, you need a spare battery. And it changes people's lives, I think, because it moves the bookends of what's a problem. And so I guarantee you that you go there for one season and you come home and you just think, wow, I have no real problems in my life right now because everything's great and I can deal with everything that happens to me. So I think it's also a huge cultural experience for us, not just science, but as people, you know, just kind of like, it resets your compass in a way that nothing else will probably.
Do you guys do an annual screening of the thing?
I think the thing is probably watched more than once a season. People on the ice.
It is
but the camaraderie is what's incredible, and you know, when everyone is using the same resources. So I might be at a remote field camp with 2 or 3 science teams, and I'm going to see only some things in the valley I'm working in. So we get together and talk over beer at night about what we're seeing, what we're doing. As we're waiting for a storm to clear, again, we sit down and talk. And you know, most importantly, you know, I spend my whole season kind of like this, which is not a very effective way to see what's going on. So I mean, I rely on the helicopter pilots who are out there every day shuttling supplies and people around to kind of clue me into what's going on in the next valley over. And if I can explain to them the kinds of questions I'm asking, then there's a whole multiplication of people, you know, whether it's helicopter pilots or people on their science teams who get an idea of what everyone is doing, and then everyone is pitching in, making observations, trying to improve everyone's science. So it's great. And the people like Lily act as the glue, because I got to McMurdo and she had been there for a month and knew everyone. So this should not come as a surprise, you know Lily. So she introduced me to new collaborators and new colleagues, which was great.
Thank you all so much for coming, and thanks for